Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Crude Conflict, the Iran War and its Consequences for the Middle East and Global Energy Security, the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations' third webinar in a series on the Iran War. If you have not seen the previous webinars, please feel free to check them out on our website and YouTube channel. We are delighted to have you join us for what promises to be another timely and substantive discussion on a region once again at the center of global strategic attention. We are now 19 days into a conflict that is affecting at least 25 countries kinetically and at least 3 more with intelligence sharing for those kinetic operations and virtually every nation on Earth economically. We've brought together an extraordinary panel of distinguished analysts and practitioners, and today 2 ambassadors and 2 energy experts to navigate these choppy seas with us. If you have any questions, please send them to questions@nukusar.org. It is now my privilege to turn over the event to our moderator, Abderrahim Foukara, a longtime personal friend and friend of the council, and the former Washington bureau chief and host of Min Washington, Al Jazeera English's flagship program, on what is now the world's leading news network. Abderrahim, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. William Lawrence. Good morning. The time may be different depending where you are. Obviously, for those of us, people who are following this webinar, greetings to you all. It is my great privilege to host this great lineup of guests, as Dr. Lawrence has just said. And I have on this panel Ambassador Joey Hood. He's a former Assistant Secretary, Department of State's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, former U.S. Ambassador to Tunisia, and former Consul General and Principal Officer in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, among many other functions that he occupied. I have also Ambassador Amin Masoud Ma'louf. Ambassador Masoud Ma'louf is the former ambassador of Lebanon to Canada, Poland, Chile, and he served in other places around the world as well. Dr. Sara Vashkouri, Center for Energy, Security and Diplomacy Chair, Institute for World Peace. She is founder and president, SVB Energy International. Last but not least, Professor Matthew McManus. He's a visiting fellow, National Center for Energy Analytics, adjunct professor of energy diplomacy, Georgetown University, Walsh School of Foreign Service. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to do an initial round of comments from each one of the panelists, depending on their particular purview. Each one of them will speak for about 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll get into the wider lens discussion later on. If I may start with Ambassador Joey Hood, if you could just give us your take at this particular point in the conflict, your particular take on the regional geopolitical stakes.
Thank you, Abderrahim. It's an honor to be with you and with my co-panelists and our viewers today. Happy last day of Ramadan to those who are celebrating, and Eid Mubarak in advance. I think in terms of the geopolitics of what we're seeing right now, Dr. Lawrence hit it on the head when he said this is a conflict that is affecting the entire world. I think nowhere more so than in the Gulf Cooperation Council area. Excuse me. And I think what we're seeing now are the consequences of an administration that has devalued professionals, devalued listening to expertise. Career officials, like some of those that we have here on the panel, we are like the civilian equivalent of UAVs. We can hover over a problem for a very long time, study it, understand patterns of life, patterns of business, patterns of commerce, we can then come up with ideas and recommendations as to what's likely to happen if the president makes this decision or that decision, or if another country makes a decision. And this has certainly been the case when it comes to Iran. Civilians and military planners have been planning for just this sort of scenario for decades. And so for anyone to say that, well, we didn't see these attacks coming, we had no idea the Iranians would try this or that, they're either not telling the truth or they're being incompetent. We saw this in the way that the administration did not prepare to move American citizens out of the region, or at least give them some options in the run-up to hostilities. And we're also seeing this now, where time and again, we keep saying that we're getting surprised by attacks on energy infrastructure and on military locations and other infrastructure. It just isn't a surprise. As I said, planners knew that this was going to be the sort of response we were going to see. And I think planners also knew that this war was more likely than not to happen, whether it's this year or next year or 3 years from now, because the Iranian model of exporting its revolution to Lebanon, to Syria, to Iraq, to Yemen, and having armed militias in all of these places was not sustainable. But now we've got this crisis, which means we have an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the GCC countries in the United States to arrive at a much more mature security relationship. We've been operating on the same basis that King Abdulaziz ibn Saud and President Roosevelt established in 1945 on board the USS Quincy. It's now time to move to something that's more appropriate for 2026 and beyond, which is a NATO-like arrangement between the United States and the GCC countries, which I think would be much more appropriate for the type of situation we have in the world today.
Ambassador Hood, thank you very much for that. Ambassador Masoud Ma'louf, pare this down, the stakes, as we've just heard from Ambassador Hood, pare them down for us to Lebanon, which has been engulfed in the war now.
Good morning, Abdurrahim. Good morning to everybody. And as Ambassador Hood said, we are at the last day of Ramadan. Today, tomorrow will be the first day of Eid al-Fitr and the first day of spring, the renewal of life. So let's hope that our lives will be renewed, especially in the Middle East. With regards to Lebanon, we all know what's going on in Lebanon, how Israel is pounding the country, how it is displacing 1 million people from the south of Lebanon towards the north. It's equivalent to 1/5 of the population. But in order to understand what's going on now, let's have a little bit of a background, what led to this. On the 7th of October 2003, we know what Hamas did in Israel. And then the next day, the war that Netanyahu led on Hamas. The next day, immediately on the 8th of October, the Hezbollah in Lebanon decided to support Hamas. It started bombarding the north of Israel and doing some military operations against Israel. And then the war started on that day, on the 8th of October 2023, between Israel and Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. That war lasted almost 1 year until Israel killed the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and a lot of the leadership. And then there was a ceasefire in Lebanon. That ceasefire was agreed upon by Israel, by the government of Lebanon, and by Hezbollah. For 15 months, Israel kept violating the ceasefire on a daily basis. Like several thousand times in 15 months, Israel has violated the ceasefire, and there was no reaction from Hezbollah until the 2nd of March of this year, or the 1st of March, when Ali Khamenei was killed in Iran. And then all of a sudden, Hezbollah decided to send a few rockets into Israel. And that's when hell broke loose completely. Israel, of course, it was not something that Israel was not prepared for. They have plans to what to do in Lebanon, what they want to do. We know that Netanyahu has a lot of problems, legal problems, and he knows that in case he doesn't win the elections, his party, if the party doesn't win the elections next October, he won't be the prime minister, and there is a strong chance that he might go to jail. So what we see from him doing is wars on all fronts, to convince the Israeli population that he is defending the Israelis on all fronts. That's why we see the war in Iran and now in Lebanon. Unfortunately, Hezbollah gave Netanyahu the excuse to do what he is doing now in Lebanon, although they didn't need an excuse, but this excuse that Hezbollah gave them helped them a lot internationally in the United States, with France, with countries of the West. Now everybody says that it's up to Hezbollah, that they are responsible for what happened and they should be disarmed. The government of Lebanon had already taken a decision to disarm Hezbollah, but it was not implemented in the ground in order to avoid civil war. We know that the army has about 30% of the people, of the soldiers in the army are Shiites. Many of them probably are close to Hezbollah. They were worried that the army might completely get divided. They were worried that there might be a civil war in Lebanon. So they were taking it slowly, trying to convince Hezbollah, trying to negotiate. Unfortunately, it seems that the day that Ali Khamenei was killed in Iran, Iran decided to open that front in Lebanon, and that's where we are now, with more than 1,000 people killed so far, among them more than 80, 85 children, a lot of women, also people who have nothing to do with the war. And Israel keeps saying that Hezbollah is a great danger, that they do this and they do that in order to find an excuse to keep what they are doing. We can
Thank you.
talk about that more in detail later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador Malouf. Dr. Bashkouri, obviously the global energy stakes are very high. Can you talk about where you see them headed?
Unfortunately, they have been heading to a place that the world really didn't wish to see it, almost 3 weeks. And everybody knew that, as it was mentioned, this region is a region that supplies majority, a huge portion of oil, natural gas, but it's not just energy, fertilizer, which is important for the food, helium, that was actually a byproduct of the unit, the LNG producing unit in Qatar that was targeted yesterday, and is directly applicable for semiconductors. So unfortunately, a lot at stake. During the first and second week, the major concern of the world was flow of energy, and the actual barrels and actual molecules of energy in terms of production were not disrupted, but they could not be transferred because of the closure of Strait of Hormuz and the huge risk, investment cost. However, it seems that we have entered a new layer of conflict, that the infrastructure are directly being targeted by Israel, targeting Iranian South Pars, their largest gas field, which it's directly supplies to their electricity production, and Iran retaliating on the neighboring infrastructure. So unfortunately, now the infrastructure are at risk, which makes this interruption of supply prolonged into the market, even if you're having, let's say, a peace, which at this point no one knows when and what the end game is going to be. So now we have moved from the flow of molecules being at the risk to their production being at the risk. Also, we had refineries that have been targeted, which that is going to put a lot of pressure for products. one thing that here I would like to mention and note, which is very concerning, from beginning. I remember the first Monday that the market opened, Monday, 6th of March, the first reaction to the war. I indicated this in interviews, my writings, that the market has not been reacted the way human traders would react. And we are week 3 with all these tensions in the market. We see that the benchmarks in the stock market, the paper oil, is somehow being controlled either through the headlines or other ways that no one really can understand. The algorithms, pricing algorithms, perhaps being manipulated by the soothing headlines. If you look at the benchmarks in the paper market, the prices are much lower than the physical market. So if you want to buy an oil, a barrel of oil in the market is between $40 to $70 higher than the benchmark. For us in the United States, having a lower controlled benchmark is a plus, because we have a lot of oil and gas, and most of the prices, even though we import a lot, but prices are set based on their international benchmarks. But in terms of global supply and the impact of real price on inflation, global inflation, and access to the customers around the world, unfortunately, the current prices that we're looking and have been looking, none of them are reflecting the real drama and the real crisis that we're facing.
Thank you, Dr. Vashkouri. Professor Matthew McManus, now talk a little bit about your hopes and concerns when it comes to America's strategic oil reserves and what they mean for Americans, but also what they mean for the rest of the world at this particular point in time.
Thank you, Dr. Fukara. You know, I believe the Strategic Petroleum Reserve goes back to the founding of the International Energy Agency at the State Department by Henry Kissinger. And it really is a multilateral fire department, if you will, for a physical supply disruption. So the IEA agreed this month to release some 400 million barrels of strategic stocks, 172 million by the United States. That was a consensus of 32 countries, primarily OECD. And I think it's a very important reaction. It's a very important supply response. Of the 20 million barrels in the Gulf, you have to remember, you have both Yanbu and you have Fujairah, which I know was attacked in a day or two ago. But you do have about 5 to 6 million barrels a day. We know the Saudis are moving oil out of Yanbu. So then you have to, compensate for that loss. The SPR, the IEA can contribute to take care of part of that loss. Certainly, you can never replace the entire Persian Gulf, but that is a big buffer. It's an insurance policy. It's being deployed. And I think that is why oil is trading only at $100 a barrel in the US. And it's a lot higher. It's about 114, the Brent London spread. So you are seeing, as our previous speaker noted, a divergence in the base price of oil in the US and Europe. And you're going to see that even more in natural gas. Natural gas in Europe today is up over 30%. Given the attack on Ras Laffan. And there is no strategic petroleum reserve for gas. And that's also that one plant from Qatar is about 18% of global LNG supplies. So I think on oil, for the next 120 days, you do have, again, the IEA, a bit of a fire department addressing a shortfall. You can never replace the Persian Gulf, largest flow in the world, but it is being managed, and I think so far that's why you're seeing a price that is under $100 a barrel. Thank you.
I wanted to stay with you, if I may, Professor Matthew McManus, with regard to what you have just talked about. You responded to the Wall Street Journal's article, America's Strategic Oil Exports, on March the 12th. You responded to it yesterday. And in your response, you gave credit to former House Speaker Paul Ryan. You gave credit, as we just heard from you, also to Henry Kissinger you gave credit to a subsequent bipartisan agreement, as you called it, for the investment in an American strategic petroleum reserve. And you said, and I'm quoting, while the previous administration sold off a record quantity of stored barrels to manage prices, leaving much reduced buffer, fortunately, there's still enough in US and IEA stockpiles to make possible IEA's record March 11th authorization to release stored oil. First question I wanted to ask you about this. You seem to imply, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Republicans did well on this, the Democrats did not.
So this is a bipartisan strategic reserve. It's been used more than 4 times by presidents of both parties. It is designed for a physical supply disruption. We did not have a physical disruption in the case of Russia. We had a price spike. Here you have the contingency that the world has been planning for, and the international community is responding. It is helpful that America is the largest exporter or producer of oil and gas now at 13.4 million barrels per day, also of LNG, of natural gas. And of that natural gas, we only export 20%. So our prices are definitely stranded from global prices in LNG, but not in oil. Oil is a world market. But the SPR is a bipartisan investment. And it is the architecture of OECD, International Energy Agency, great multilateral cooperation. And that is working.
Ambassador Hood, if I may come back to you now, based on what we've just heard from Professor Matthew McManus, in your initial remarks, you said that nobody can pretend that we didn't know that the war would be this ugly, both for the geopolitics, but also for global energy and other aspects of human life. How much blame do the Republicans take on this as opposed to the Democrats?
Well, I think this is a perennial problem, Abdrahim, in different ways. I remember when the Biden administration came in, they were talking about pivoting to Asia and reestablishing alliances with Europe. And those of us who hover over the Middle East and North Africa for our careers reminded them that this was a region that they were going to have to pay attention to whether they wanted to or not. And that became blindingly obvious when around the end of the summer of 2021, when the president decided we were going to need to evacuate a lot of people from Afghanistan really fast. How do you do that? Well, you turn to the places where you have a lot of aircraft and a lot of landing space, and that was the GCC countries. And so now, with this administration, that attention to the Gulf countries was not the problem. President Trump has made it his priority to visit the Gulf as his first visit, or among his first visits in his first term and in this term. And as we've seen, was able to ink a lot of deals and promises with regard to investments in both directions, arms sales, and all sorts of things. But unfortunately, there's this disregard in this administration, much to the difference of the first Trump administration, a disregard for planning, for expertise, for listening to the people who've been working on these problems for a very long time. Part of that is understandable. You've been working on this problem forever and you haven't solved it. So why should we listen to you and your recommendations? If you knew what you were doing, you would have solved it before. But at the same time, even if a group of experts don't necessarily have all the solutions to all the problems, they do know an awful lot about the way a regime thinks, the way a population might react, and the sorts of reactions that you might see in terms of an armed conflict like this. It was blindingly obvious that the regime was going to go after the targets that it's gone after. So very little of this has been unpredictable.
So, if I may stay with you, Ambassador Hood, given what you have just said, obviously the war is still ongoing. We will talk about what the future may look like or may not look like in a little while. But talk a little bit about the dynamics now between the United States and the Gulf countries, given what you have just said, that you say that everybody knew that if war came to pass, there'd be a lot of damage.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's much of a dynamic that we can talk about right now at all. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of exchange of views between the governments. You don't see phone calls and visits and meetings being convened. You don't see special envoys, secretaries, cabinet secretaries moving around doing consultations like in the days of one of the people you mentioned, Henry Kissinger, for example. You don't really see much, if any, of that. And I think this is a consequence of what I said earlier, that the security relationship and the political and economic relationships between the United States and the GCC did not really advance at the same pace or to the same levels that they could have. Our security infrastructure, in terms of the relationship itself, is still operating under what Roosevelt and Abdulaziz established over 80 years ago. That has got to evolve. If we had established a NATO-like arrangement between the United States and the GCC, which has been talked about for some 60 years, then we probably wouldn't be seeing what we're seeing today, because, of course, Iran wouldn't dare to take a shot at Ras Laffan if it knew that by doing so, the weight of not just the United States, but all the GCC countries would be upon it in a heartbeat. That would definitely change calculations. And we need to change the calculus going forward. Otherwise, we're going to see ourselves in conflicts like this every 6 months, every year, every 18 months, and so forth.
Ambassador Malouf, obviously, we cannot talk about Lebanon without talking about a whole host of different protagonists, among them, obviously, the United States and France. What do you see the Europeans trying to do, and do you think they would be successful or not in dealing with Lebanon in a way that may lead to a wider role in this conflict?
Well, let's start with the United States. We know that the first and foremost priority of the United States in the Middle East is Israel. So whatever Israel does, as long as it doesn't affect the interests of the United States, it's okay with the United States foreign policy. With regards to Europe, Europe is trying to do anything possible to stop the war, while at the same time blaming Hezbollah for starting. Today, we're going to have in Lebanon the foreign minister of France, Jean-Noël Barrot. We don't think that he can stop the war. We don't think that he can do anything except give probably some assistance, some humanitarian assistance. That's what Europe in general is trying to do, and making some statements saying that, oh, the war should stop and the government of Lebanon should disarm Hezbollah. And now they are starting to see, and we have seen some statements in this regard, they're starting to see that it is impossible for the government to disarm Hezbollah while Israel continues bombarding Lebanon, bombarding all places, destroying buildings inside Beirut, in the capital. And sometimes really a lot of innocent people are killed, and Hezbollah does not seem to be much weakened, although in the beginning of the war and before what happened, we have seen that the government had taken a very strong statement against having Hezbollah being armed and doing anything. The president of the republic, when he was elected, in his acceptance speech, he said that the government should be alone responsible for decisions of war and peace, and there shouldn't be any weapons outside the Lebanese army and outside the Lebanese government authority. In the same time, when the government was changed, the government of Dr. Nawaf Salam, in their ministerial statement upon which they got the approval and the confidence of the parliament, according to the Lebanese constitution, it also said that weapons should be only in the hands of the government. And the army was in charge of disarming Hezbollah first phase on the south of the Litani and the second phase in the north of the Litani. And for some reason, we have heard from the military, from the Lebanese army chief, that south of the Litani, there are no more weapons in the hands of Hezbollah. But it seems that, I don't know, either the army was mistaken or nobody knows what the reason is. It seems that everybody was surprised to see how Hezbollah has a lot of weapons in the south and is still continuing to fight with Israel. And that is why we hear the Europeans and especially the French, who really care for Lebanon due to the past relations between Lebanon and France, they keep saying, while they call on the end of the war, they keep saying that Hezbollah should be disarmed. Hezbollah is responsible for what's going on. So, in two words, the Europeans are trying to find a solution. Their means are limited. They cannot impose on Israel a solution. They cannot force Israel to stop. And in the same time, the only way they can help is by providing some humanitarian assistance to 1/5 of the population of Lebanon that has been displaced, many of them in the streets of Beirut. Yeah.
Well, on that, Ambassador Ma'louf, on the issue of the challenges now facing Lebanon, you mentioned one of them, 1/5 of the population, you say, has been displaced. There's a high casualty rate, 900 people killed, more than 2,000 injured. The targeting of infrastructure, military incursion by the Israelis, economic paralysis. In the middle of all this, you seem to be saying that Lebanon is on its own. Is that a fair interpretation of what he said?
To a very certain extent, yes, Lebanon is on its own. And on top of the destruction and the problems that you have mentioned, Abdurrahim, Israel is now destroying bridges over the Litani River so that people who go north cannot return south. They pretend that Hezbollah is using or has been using these bridges to send armed people and weapons to the south, which many people doubt is true, but they are using this. Everybody now in Lebanon, almost I would say, should say, everybody thinks that Israel is trying to create an empty zone there to not let the people return to their houses in the south by destroying villages entirely. They're raising the villages to the soil, to the ground. And it is really a huge problem for Lebanon. And if the people cannot return to the south, imagine 1/5 of the population leaving a little bit more than 1/5 of the area of Lebanon and moving north, no houses for them, no places to stay, being in the streets. And the only thing that countries are helping with, sending some kind of food or something like that to help the people, or tents to let them get covered from the sun or from the rain. And it's really a very, very disastrous situation for Lebanon at the time being now.
I would like to go to Dr. Vashkouri, but if you bear with me, I just want to quickly go back to Ambassador Hood on this issue. Ambassador Hood, would the Europeans be able to do better in Lebanon if they accepted to the call by President Donald Trump to help with the war against Iran, do you think?
Well, I think the Europeans could have a consolidated position that would say, even if they're not going to participate in maritime military efforts to try to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, for example, which the president wants, they could very clearly state that the time of a regime like the one in Iran funding and controlling, or at least strongly influencing militias in other people's countries is over. And so now we need to move to the next phase. And how do you do that? We need to take bold moves. I think we need to make bold moves in the face of this crisis. And what would that look like? For Lebanon, it would be the complete disarmament of Hezbollah, which only the Lebanese armed forces could do. But they require more support. The United States has provided some support to them over the years. The Europeans could do much more. And the United States and Europe together could certainly help nurture a final peace treaty between Lebanon and Israel. That's what's going to finally give Lebanon and Israel the peace that they desperately need to be able to develop and keep their people safe. It's not going after Hezbollah for the 85th time, because there will be an 86th and an 87th time. But it's about getting a final peace treaty. And those things require lots and lots of support, as we saw with Egypt, as we saw with Jordan in the decades past.
Dr. Vashkouri, now, how much is energy and the spike in oil prices, how much is it of a problem is it for the Europeans as opposed to the Americans?
Obviously a lot more, especially when it comes to natural gas, because it's the electricity prices in the Europe. And in the United States, we have kind of what we call it energy independence. Even though we still import molecules, we import oil for our refineries, but particularly regarding the natural gas and electricity production, we don't have really any issue in Europe. The countries are going to have a huge problem, because even though US is exporting a lot of LNG and replaced a lot of share of Russian gas LNG export, still US LNG is sold not as a charity or subsidized product, but as a global prices. So, and these countries already are suffering from post-COVID recovery, prices spike, and also Ukraine-Russia war. So all these governments already allocated just few years ago a huge amount of subsidies for their electricity and energy production. So they are going to suffer way more than the United States. And also, as I mentioned, there has been a lot of, I think there's a lot of discussion. It's not really clear why the oil energy market it's lagging in terms of physical market and benchmark. But for me, in the topic that I work, if you look at the prices, most of the prices now are algorithmic prices, and they're highly sensitive to headlines. So if we look at it almost every day during the war, around 4 to 5 p.m., there is some positive bearish headline coming out of the United States administration, ranging from the war will end soon to even release of these strategic petroleum reserves. There are a lot of debates that how much would be and how fast, what is the flow? Because the number, if you look at if you look at it as a headline that OECD countries and US are releasing petroleum, the petroleum reserves, it's obviously have an important impact on the market sentiments. And if you are look at the algo's pricing, reading it, they will quickly calculate the number of barrels, and they say, okay, we have, let's say, 120 days of barrels coming to the market. They do the mathematical calculation, but there's a lot of nuances into that. Are these barrels actually going to flow the way that we're expecting? For instance, there are discussions that would United States actually releasing those reserves, or they're going to trade them? Would Europe release them? And also the quality of crude oil. You know, not every crude is going to match the crude oil that is passing through the Strait of Hormuz. So going back to your specific question regarding European Union, and I think European Union and a lot of energy importers, Asian markets, Japan, India, they're going to all suffer because they're independent on energy imports. And like in the United States, they don't have those pricing buffer that we have. China, however, there has been a lot of argument that China would definitely rationally going to being hurt from this war because a lot of the exports goes to China. But China has built a huge stock for the past 2 years. So China has a huge buffer. And also China has been importing oil from the Strait of Hormuz to a certain degree. European Union, certain Asian consumers, global economy, food security. And
Right.
if we just briefly, I want to mention that if you look at the war, the escalation of the war has been had in these levels of escalation. The targets first being mostly the military targets. And even when President Trump ordered the attack on Iran's largest export port, Khark, the energy infrastructure were not being targeted. The military side's been targeted. But the Israel attack on South Pars, which President Trump indicated in his recent tweet on the troops, that it was not he was not aware of it, because President Trump and his administration are very well aware of the energy business. So
Right.
there was no target of energy infrastructure, but Israel's action on the South Pars now has triggered a new level of the war that is directly impacting the energy infrastructure.
Okay, I wanted to stay with the issue of Europe, Dr. Vashkouri. So, based on what you have just said, that the energy crisis is affecting the Europeans more than it is affecting the Americans, where does that leave the issue of President Trump being frustrated, as it's being said, that the Europeans would not step into the fray with regard to the situation in the Strait of Hormuz? Is he frustrated, or do you think he's just biding his time? Because at the end of the day, the global the energy situation will force the Europeans to step into the fray.
Well, the thing is that I guess no one in the world, from Europe to GCC countries, no one knows what is the goals of this war in terms of what is the victory, what is the end game, and what is the process going to be. So if we look at it from European perspective, when we are talking about the aid or help, what is it really required? Because is this what exactly are required from European to escort tanker by tanker? It's not possible, because now we have moved beyond the Strait of Hormuz and flow of oil. We have actual molecules, we have gas and oil infrastructure being targeted, which even if Europeans step in and they open the Strait of Hormuz, it's going to take months or years to replace and recover this infrastructure. So unfortunately, as much as this war, it's confusing, but there are a lot of headlines. It's a war of headlines. Distinguishing of this frustration with to action plan, or how these, for what I look at it, how these multiple headlines are impacting the daily prices, the daily notion and sentiment of the market, is really confusing and a lot to understand. But going back to the European Union, I would say that the escalation of the war, because it seems like, just based on what President Trump just mentioned about the attack on South Pars, it seems that Israel just attacks wherever it suits or wherever they decide to attack. And this happens without coordination with President Trump's administration. And that creates these havocs, because now things are out of control. What if Israel decides tomorrow to take and extend this level of war into a higher level, that Iran would start retaliating on water infrastructure in the region, which could be catastrophic. And the elimination of the Iranian leaders, while it could be seen as a victorious move and goal, something that is happening is that the new layers of leaders in Iran are not known to anyone, to the public. So going back to what Ambassador Hood was saying, the understanding the country is getting more vague and harder. the next move definitely is more radical, and the prospects of, let's say, European Union or China or countries that start creating some sort of mediation that was discussed by like other speakers and ambassador, who specifically, it's just getting harder and harder because now those leaders are somewhere in a basement, no one knows who they are, and we just see that they're getting more radical in terms of their revenge strategy.
Professor McManus, on the issue of China, which Dr. Vashkouri mentioned just a little while ago, from the perspective of energy supplies, how much impetus do you think China feels to help de-escalate the situation, not just in terms of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, but in terms of what's happening in Iran in general, given the traditional relationship between China and Iran?
That's a great question. 80% of the oil from Hormuz does go to Asia, led by China, and gas as well. And you had the unusual statement of the Foreign Ministry of China sort of chiding Iran early in the war not to attack its neighbors. So they cannot be happy, particularly that gas has been attacked. China also has a big strategic petroleum reserve, over 1 billion barrels, but they're also the largest oil importer, about 10 million barrels per day. So they're not acting in concert with the IEA, but the IEA has sent signals that they hope that they will, and I think it is in their interest to do so. So it's actually helpful that China has these huge reserves, and I think that like I noted, you've already heard them ask for turning down the temperature, particularly Iran attacking energy facilities, and I would expect you would hear more from them today, and because that is really where they're getting their energy from. So it's a very, very big problem for China.
So when Professor Matthew McManus, when you hear some people say, actually China has a vested interest
Absolutely
in this conflict being prolonged, is that accurate or is that conspiracy theory?
I think that for China's economic lifeblood, which is energy, they would want to see the conflict be shorter. They have benefited from lower energy prices because of the sanctions they've been buying on the black market, the shadow fleet of both Russia and Chinese oil. And one other thing the administration has done is given a 30-day suspension to sanctioned Russian oil, which is largely floating, as we know, off India and China. And that will put another 30 million barrels per day or 30 million barrels total into the market.
So what do you think, Professor McManus, what do you think all this now means for the GCC countries in terms of being able to export their oil and their gas, and in terms of the future of their economies?
Well, I think it speaks to Saudi foresight in 1982 of building the East-West pipeline and having redundancy, which was idled for many years. It wasn't operating at full capacity because it was an insurance policy. You have Iraq now exporting through Ceyhan. So there was a lot of multiple export routes. I think you're going to find the GCC countries are going to have to invest in those opportunities. They're going to have to store more of their oil and gas outside of the Gulf. And I think it definitely is going to change the paradigm for their primary export. And I think that could be accomplished with storage outside of the region, as well as additional pipelines to the Red Sea and to Europe and the Mediterranean, like they used to have. So it is a problem you could solve.
Ambassador Hood, what about you? How do you see this basically shaping the economic or the future economic fortunes of the GCC countries?
Well, Abdurrahim, just to go back to what you were asking about with regard to China, I think one thing it does is it finally puts to rest this idea that somehow China is the rising power in the GCC. China is going to come to the rescue of the region. China is the way of the future. Where is China in all of this? They aren't even able to secure their own oil supplies. So I think that just adds more impetus to what I was saying earlier, that it's time for the United States and the GCC to graduate to a new level of a security relationship, something like what we have with the Western European countries. So I think now is the time for more intense diplomacy. Unfortunately, we're not seeing it. And part of the reason is that it's not happening at the working level. I mean, we've obviously had to send a lot of our diplomats out of harm's way, a lot of family members, but normally we keep at least a core crew of people at an embassy, even in the worst of situations, as we've seen in Baghdad, as we saw in previous wars. But we're in some cases we're not doing that. We have no ambassadors at all in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi. In Kuwait, we not only don't have an ambassador, we don't have diplomats anymore. We completely shuttered the embassy. And in Doha, we not only removed the ambassador, we removed the ambassador's deputy. So there are very few senior diplomats with experience who are able to go around, get the views of the population, of the government, and start recommending ideas and next steps back to Washington. None of that appears to be happening. So I think the diplomacy has a long way, a long road to make up once this crisis is behind us.
So, Ambassador Hood, Iran, obviously, in times of peace and in times of war, is the neighbor, has always been the neighbor, and will always continue to be the neighbor of the GCC countries. So, what are the challenges from your perspective that the GCC countries face now in terms of dealing with the war going on against Iran, but also dealing with the United States? And the United States has a defense infrastructure throughout the GCC countries.
I guess I'm going to sound like a broken record, Abdurrahim, but one of the constant concerns that we hear expressed from governments and citizens in the Gulf region is that, well, you can just get up and leave, as you did in Vietnam, as you did in Afghanistan, but we can't. We live here, and we're always going to live here. Well, a new NATO-like structure would provide a lot of reassurance that we're not going anywhere. And I think it would also affect the calculus of regimes like the one in Tehran, that if the United States has a treaty with these countries and will come to their defense, and they will come to the defense of each other, then that raises the threshold, just as it is done in Western Europe, for military conflict. That doesn't mean everything's going to be rainbows and unicorns. There will still be obviously problems and challenges to address, but we wouldn't be getting into conflicts like this on any regular basis. So I think for the GCC countries, that new level of diplomacy, which they really haven't seen before, they're going to have to start engaging in from the bottom up and the top down. And they're going to have to then, that's for the United States, but then they're going to have to see what results from across the water. Do we have a regime that is just wounded but still there and very, very angry and even more dangerous? Or is there a new regime entirely? Have the Iranian people risen up and have they taken over? Has there been some sort of a military coup or a military arrangement that sidelines the Ayatollahs? We don't know. But for now, the best assessment appears to be that the regime is weakened, but still there. And a weakened regime with that ideology is a much more dangerous regime. So all the more reason for the GCC governments to cleave even closer to the United States and to demand a much more mature security and political and economic relationship with us.
Ambassador Malouf, I will come to you in a minute just to expand on some of the things that Ambassador Hood talked about. But since Professor Matthew McManus will have to leave us in a few minutes. If you'll allow me to just go to him, maybe for a final comment from him before he splits. Professor McManus, how about the energy relationship between the United States and the GCC countries now? What do you see? What do you see in the tea leaf for it?
Well, I think as Dr. Rebecca Shuri noted, the American LNG will have to fill the gap for Ras Laffan for a while. And the United States also has competition for LNG for data centers. And so I think the biggest impact is going to be in the LNG space because that's not going to be easily repaired. Right now, we're only seeing refineries that will need to be repaired in the oil producing part of the Gulf. So I think that this will put more pressure on American producers to meet global demand. I think it will raise the global price for gas in Europe and Asia, not so much in the US, because again, we're only exporting 20%. But remember, American companies are major investors in the Gulf. And I think they've been long-term partners since the founding of Aramco. So I think they will work together to rebuild against these really perilous Iranian attacks.
Professor Matthew McManus, thank you very much for having been part of this panel. I understand you will leave in a couple of minutes. My thanks to you on behalf of the council as well.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ambassador Malouf. Talk about the various perceptions now, if I may call it that, in the Middle East of what the Americans have done or are trying to do in this war against Iran.
Well, the United States is involved really in this war on the side of Israel, as we see. And with regards to Lebanon, they are trying to put an end to what Israel is doing, but not with great success. Although the president of Lebanon has already said that Lebanon is ready for direct talks with Israel, whether in Cyprus or in Paris. France has encouraged that, and the United States have encouraged such a thing. And Lebanon has gone to the point even to nominate the members of the delegation that will be negotiating with Israel. But until now, Israel has not said that they are ready. They are willing to negotiate with Lebanon. And this is the first time in many, many years that Lebanon says that we are ready to negotiate face to face with Israel. Not anymore indirect talks, direct talks with Israel. But until now, we don't see anything from the side of Israel except bombardments and destruction. With regards to the United States in this war in general, although President Trump has said many things that contradict what he says either a few hours ago or a day or two ago before that, there is only one thing that I take seriously from President Trump, and I think it is the real truth that he's going, how the United States will act, is when he said, in answering one question, when the war will end and how will it, he said, we will end the war in coordination with Israel. So I don't think the United States will withdraw from the war, will do anything without Israel. So, and Israel, we know that they have an interest. Their objectives of the war are a little bit different from the objectives of the United States. They want to destroy completely Iran. They don't want Iran. They want to change the regime in Iran and things like that. So I personally do not think that the United States will withdraw from the war as long as Israel is in this war. So we will see. And another thing to take into account, I don't think it will be in the interest of President Trump to stop the war, even if he's capable of separating himself from Israel, as long as the Hormuz is closed. So it will be like a defeat to the United States if it withdraws from the war while the Strait of Hormuz is still closed, and while the 400 to 450 kilograms of uranium is still in the hands of Iran, of the regime of Iran. So then everybody will say to President Trump, why did you go to this war if you haven't achieved, if now the Strait of Hormuz is closed, the uranium is still in the hands of Iran and the danger is there. It's 60% uranium. So that's why I think it's going to be difficult in the next few days, maybe next few weeks, even for the United States to stop being involved in this war.
Obviously, a lot of prominent leaders in Iran have been killed by the Israelis and the Americans since the beginning of this war. There's been a lot of damage to the infrastructure and other various spheres of life in Iran. What is your assessment, Ambassador Malouf, to what this war has done to the Iranians in terms of whether they rally around the leadership or whether there are cracks that may lead to the outcome that President Donald Trump and the Israelis want, which is to change the regime?
A very, very important question. It seems to a certain point that the demonstrations and the people who are against the government that President Trump and Israel were trying to encourage, I think they have withdrawn because the government, the Iranian government, has shown at what point and to which point they are ready to kill them. They killed already many thousands of them before even the war, and they will be ready now under the war with the dangers that are in line with the government now with the regime of Iran. Of course, they will be even more hardline in trying to quell this. And on the another side also, the Iranians are seeing that there are foreign forces coming and destroying their country. So even if they are against the regime, but they are not against their own country, they are not against their own infrastructure, against also the oil fields that are the lifeline for the Iranian population. So that's why I don't think that there will be any change in the population's position against their government. And as we have seen, when a leader in Iran has been killed, he has been replaced by someone who is even more hardline than the one who has been killed. So I don't foresee any change in the government, although militarily Iran has been weakened. I think what Israel and the United States are counting on at the moment is that since they have destroyed so much of the Iranian facilities, weapons facilities, and weapon producing machines, probably they are counting that the reserves in weapons of Iran will dwindle so quickly or so at a certain point that Iran will not be able anymore to continue the war. And but anyway, the future is extremely not clear, very unclear. We don't know how it will end. We don't see what President Trump has asked, like a complete unconditional surrender from Iran. That's, I think, out of the question as long as the regime is in place. So we'll have to wait for a change in the regime, which is not something that's going to happen overnight, it seems.
Ambassador Hood, if I may return to you before I go to Dr. Vashkouri. Obviously, there was a lot of mistrust between Iran and several of the GCC countries, between Iran and Israel, no love lost, between Iran and the United States, no love lost for decades. Do you still think that what President Donald Trump did in terms of going into this war was not a well-studied, well-calculated step, or the United States ultimately, some people will argue, did not have the choice not to deal with this dilemma at one point or another, and President Donald Trump is now just a trailblazer, whether you agree with what he did or not.
Well, whether you agree with President Trump or not, I do think that this war was going to happen at some point or another. It's Iran that started it in 1979 by taking the unprecedented move of, since the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century, of taking hostages of our diplomats and holding them for 444 days. So since that time, they've been taking shots at us, killing Marines in Beirut, by killing hundreds of Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan, and threatening and killing lots and lots of people who are citizens of those countries themselves. So when you have an ideology that this regime has, that they're a revolution, they're a movement, they're not a government that always has to be expanding. Well, that expansion is eventually going to come up against an obstacle. And in this case, that obstacle is the United States. So all that said, it doesn't mean that the war had to be prosecuted exactly this way. I do wish that the president had advisors who had a lot of experience planning for this sort of thing, thinking about this sort of thing. I'm quite certain that his chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, who does have a lot of experience in this region, was giving him much of this advice, but that's just one person. There are lots of civilians who work on, or who worked before they were removed from the government or from their offices, worked on what the energy infrastructure looks like, what the energy markets look like, what the populations were likely to do in response, including, very key, that population inside Iran. And I have to commend Ambassador Malouf for his analysis. I think he's exactly right that when you're in a country like Iran, no matter how much you hate the regime, you certainly don't like seeing Israel attacking your country, your infrastructure, and so you end up with a rally around the flag effect that was completely predictable. So I wish that the president had taken all of this into account as he was planning for this military campaign, as well as the fate of thousands of American citizens who live and work in the Gulf countries who were given no notice and no assistance until several days into the war itself, which was not necessary and not acceptable at all.
Dr. Vashkouri, I have a question which perhaps combines both politics and business. We're talking about, Ambassador Hood was talking about the enmity for decades between the United States and Iran. One main reason, among many others, for this enmity is obviously energy. When the Iranians nationalized the oil industry in Iran, their prime minister was toppled by the Americans and the British in the 50s. To what extent do you feel that the current situation harks back ultimately to energy, at least from the American perspective, first and foremost?
This is an interesting question. If we look at it in terms of United States as a country, yes, there has been this history between that you mentioned about the nationalizing the oil and the coup in the 50s. And however, I don't see this necessary as reflection of that historical approach. But if we look at President Trump administration per se, they started the discussion of energy dominance, which was first perceived as utilizing all the sources in the United States and somehow having energy independence. But later, in both events of Venezuela and Iran, I referenced President Trump and his administration that they specifically and directly said that this is about oil and we want to have access to the oil. Both in the case of Venezuela and also on Iran, that the director of Council for National Energy Dominance in the United States said this is about oil and we're going to free the oil from terrorists. So definitely, if we look at it from President Trump's administration, I think there was this calculation that I referenced to Ambassador Malouf, that he mentioned U.S. supporting Israel. Definitely, if U.S. wanted to support Israel, putting some calculations for U.S. national security, I think as part of the calculations were that yes, Iran has a lot of oil and gas, and we had some U.S. Former government officials saying that, oh, if we get Iran tomorrow, the market will be bearish, the prices will all go down because Iran has a lot of oil, a lot of gas, and they perceiving that this is going to be an easy job like Venezuela, that tomorrow we wake up and US has access to the oil and gas. Not to mention that Iran has a lot of lithium, that US needs that for the whole new industries, and mostly owned by China. So yes, I would say that based on what President Trump's administration have said in multiple occasions, they were, at least at the beginning, they were thinking that this war, as we discussed, is going to impact and hurt China's interest, because China is the major importer of oil and gas, and in a long term, US could have control over assets, energy and mineral assets in Iran. But beyond that, the Strait of Hormuz, which could give US a control over flow of all these resources that produced in the region, and from oil and gas to fertilizer to helium and minerals. So if we wanted to draw a perfect picture for US administration and US, if this would be that easy, that change the government in Iran, have access to all those minerals, take over control over the Strait of Hormuz, that would be a perfect scenario for United States, because not only Iranian assets, but the US would have a power beyond OPEC, because now is not OPEC anymore deciding how to impact the market, but is United States deciding how much oil is going to flow through the Strait of Hormuz. But as we are moving to where we are now, it seems that US could not achieve those targets, and achieving those targets are becoming a more far-fetched and vague target for United States, but also the troubles that US is facing keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. And as discussed by other speakers, as Iranian governments, the leaders are being eliminated and Iran being targeted, and was mentioned, it's gone beyond the military targets. We have infrastructure being targeted. Speaking of Iranian supporting their government or not supporting Israel, we had historical places being damaged, the heritage of the people being damaged, hospitals, the schools. So as this is moving forward, definitely achieving the energy goals in an easy way that maybe happen in Venezuela, or even a little more manageable, is getting far-fetched, because Strait of Hormuz, not only Strait of Hormuz, we just had this discussion maybe a week ago talking about Strait of Hormuz and flow. That is not anymore a headache. Now the headache is the maintaining the infrastructure safe. So yes, if US succeed, it's going to have benefits for US national interest based on President Trump's administration's definition of energy dominance. But otherwise, so far, it seems that it's somehow not that easy, and it's getting out of control.
Let me ask you a follow-up question now, Dr. Vashkouri. So obviously, Iraq, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and before that, the liberation of Kuwait in 1991. Now, Iraq was also a major oil exporter, and there were problems, energy problems, following what happened both with the invasion of Kuwait and with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Is there anything, according to you, that the world could borrow from that playbook to deal with the ramifications now, global energy ramifications of what's happening in Iran?
Um, I think this is not part of my expertise to want to comment that, for instance, how could we specifically learn from those experience in terms of why US, let's say, if we wanted to look at it from energy dominance angle, US if US did, even though that US invaded, or I don't know what is the correct terminology or diplomatic, even though that US went to these countries and somehow took over the control, but it did not help to maximizing US energy leverage and also minerals. If we look at the case of Afghanistan, when the United States went to Afghanistan, they did a whole mineral survey, something that US now is in more need for accessing to minerals because China is years and way ahead of us. But even though that the United States did all the surveys and they knew that Afghanistan has a lot of lithium, looking at the nation building, both in Iraq, a lot of oil, and in Afghanistan, a lot of minerals, US in terms of nation building was not successful. US in terms of extracting the minerals and resources was not successful. And US left all of those for China, because now who is really extracting those minerals and benefiting from them, let's say in Afghanistan, that United States did the survey, is China. So I would say that, again, like, it's not part of my expertise to find and identify the reason for that. Something that I can guess, and I can see that clearly in terms of US energy strategies, that in the United States, we constantly have a change of government from right to left extremes, and the whole agenda and strategy changes, which for energy, especially if you're looking at energy dominance, leveraging on energy and mineral resources in different countries, you need to have a sustainable long-term goals. And change of these goals, unfortunately, left no advantage for United States in both examples that you mentioned, both in terms of having access, extraction of energy, oil, gas, and also minerals. So I would say that there's no positive result of nation building post incidents, and also a good example of having access to the energy. We could mention Venezuela, but Venezuela is a very different case with Iraq and Afghanistan, and also yet we have to see that how that moves forward. But if I think Iran is more comparable with the two cases that you mentioned, and yes, we could learn a lot of lessons.
Understood. Ambassador Hood, you obviously also served in Iraq. What about you? Do you see any parallels in terms of the energy implications? Do you see any parallels between what happened in Iraq and what's happening now in Iran?
Well, yes, I think there are parallels in the sense that there was not enough attention paid to the type of planning that could have helped politicians make better decisions. There were a lot of fanciful assumptions. I won't quote them here. They've become part of the cultural lexicon at this point about what Dick Cheney said or what Don Rumsfeld said or thought. And I think we're seeing the same sorts of rosier assumptions for what was going to happen in Iran, about how the people were going to rise up, how they were going to welcome our intervention, how the regime was going to crumble, how easy this was going to be. And obviously, that's not true. That doesn't mean that we're going to get embroiled in a 20-year land war in Iran. I don't think that is in the offing. That's not what the president ran on, and he's been pretty consistent in saying that's not what he wants. So just like in Iraq, you then end up with a situation that is certainly not ideal, where you have a government in power that is either weak and really not friendly to you, or a government that is quite strong and also not friendly to you. Either one of those situations is not good for us. Then of course, you have the third possibility, which seems less likely at this point, which is that the regime does crumble and you end up with a massive civil war way beyond anything that we saw in Afghanistan or Iraq, because Iran is a very complicated country, lots of ethnicities, lots of animosities between groups of 92 million people. I don't think that it's likely that will come to pass at this point, but if it does, that's probably an even worse scenario for the United States. What I would love to see is a situation more like Vietnam, where it took some time, but both sides realized many of the mistakes that had been made and realized that we had a lot more to benefit from each other as partners rather than as enemies. And so we ended up with a very, very close economic relationship over the years. And I think that's entirely possible with Iraq. And in some ways, it seems to be developing, where you have American companies, especially in the energy sector, now starting to sign deals once again in the north, in the south. I hope that those come to fruition. I hope they lead to much, much more involvement, just like in Saudi Arabia, as over the years, Aramco was transferred from American management to Saudi management. I don't see why we can't see a very rich and deep economic relationship with Iraq, eventually someday with Iran, the way that we do in Vietnam, in Saudi Arabia, and Western Europe, and Japan, and with many of our other partners and allies.
Ambassador Malouf, on this issue of reconciliation that Ambassador Hood talked about, and each side recognizing its mistakes and moving on to a better relationship down the road, to what extent do you, given that you talked earlier about Israel, to what extent do you feel that the Israeli factor does complicate this process, if it ever becomes available, of the US and Iran recognizing their mistakes and making up?
Excellent question, Abdurrahim, because the Israeli factor is the one that started the war. So it will be the one who will end it. We know very well that at the last visit of Netanyahu to the United States, which was his seventh visit to the White House in the second term of President Trump. Before leaving Israel, he said, I'm going to meet President Trump, and the first item on our agenda is Iran. We will talk about Gaza and the region, but Iran is the first item that we want to talk about. And probably many people think that Netanyahu convinced President Trump by telling him that we can make a very quick victory in the first day or two, and then that will help you a lot in the elections. That will also help in causing trouble to China with the oil and things like that. And also, it seems that, as many observers and many members of the Congress have said it, that President Trump found in that an idea, a way that to get away from the Epstein files and things like that. So that's even the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Chris Van Hollen, said that Israel is the factor, that it's a war of Israel. And more and above, 2 days ago, when the head of the counterterrorism office resigned, Joe Kent, he said that it was in his official letter of resignation, he said that it's Israel's war more than it is the United States war.
Understood.
So
Understood.
Yeah.
I'm running a little bit out of time, but given that you also served in Latin America, I cannot let the occasion pass without asking you about Venezuela and any parallel that you see between Venezuela and Iran, very briefly.
Yes, very, very briefly. There is a huge difference between what happened in Venezuela, what's happening in Iran, but it seems that President Trump did not see that when he started the war on Iran, thinking that he can do to Iran what he did, the same success that he had in Venezuela. He thought that he would do it in Iran, but unfortunately, the situation is completely different, and that's why we see where we are now in Iran.
But we are seeing now efforts on the part of the Trump administration to ease some of the oil sanctions on Venezuela. Has Venezuela become a benefactor of the Iran war, do you think?
So Trump is trying to do anything possible that to reduce the prices of oil, the prices of energy. This is very clear because it is affecting him personally. It's affecting the way that he's supported by even by the MAGA people. So he's trying of course, sometimes he is boasting that he put his hand on the Venezuela oil, which is very good for the United States as he sees it. And we will see what will happen in the next few days and weeks. But it doesn't seem that it's going well, neither for the president nor for the United States.
Dr. Vashkouri, very briefly, has Venezuela become the beneficiary of the war in Iran in terms of energy?
I don't necessarily connect those sanctions with Iran. I think, in terms of if you mentioned specifically Russia, yes, Russian sanctions were a direct beneficiary of this war because we needed more oil. But the sanctions on Venezuela, this kind of started before by change of government in the Venezuela. So definitely the government, the new leader in Venezuela is a more alignment in the United States with the United States policies, having the trips that the U.S. administration, Secretary Wright had to Venezuela, the companies going, the change of agreements and the laws that they were before scrutinizing, the international Western companies and U.S. companies are all in a very quick process of change. And President Trump's administration, when it comes to energy diplomacy, in fact, in terms of Venezuela, they were very proactive and very active to quickly reverse some of those regulations and make it as quick as possible ready for investment of Western and US companies. So I would not necessarily see that as a consequence of Iran war or beneficiary of the war. But when it comes to Russia, yes, the removal of Russian sanctions are, I mean, even though that they mentioned they're temporary, they are definitely, Russia is benefiting from this war when it comes to the sale and income of its oil and gas.
I will soon have to go back to Dr. William Lawrence for a conclusion of this webinar. But before that, I have one more question for you, Dr. Vashkouri. You mentioned earlier in this conversation the issue of water and the catastrophic impact that, if it comes to pass, an attack on water facilities may have on not just Iran, but the whole region. There are also environmental concerns from the burning of oil installations and so on. How do you see the human cost when it comes to these issues of this war going on now in Iran?
It's very sad what is happening because I think that some of these impacts, first of all, a lot of the GCC countries have had very proactive foresight visions in terms of diversifying their economies. So all of that is going to be prolonged if this war goes further. Environmental impacts you mentioned, I do really hope and pray that we do not go to a level that the water infrastructures are going to be targeted, but the food security, economic security, energy security, and definitely the impact on the GCC members is huge. But again, this is something that has impact on global food, energy, and economic security. And we hope that it resolves soon.
Thank you all very much at the end of this conversation. Thank you to Ambassador Joey Hood. Thank you to Ambassador Masoud Ma'louf. Thank you, Dr. Sarah Vashkouri. And obviously, I also thank Professor Matthew McManus. who had to leave before the end of this conversation. He had a prior commitment. It's been my absolute privilege to have conducted this webinar. I return you now to Dr. William Lawrence.
Hello, I hope my voice is recovered. On behalf of the board and staff of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, I'd like to thank you again for attending our third webinar on the Iran war and fourth on the Gulf crisis in 2026. Today's discussion by leading human UAVs shed a lot of light on the evolving dynamics of the war, a conflict so pivotal for the region, the great powers, and the world. I'm not sure in this context we want to compare ourselves to drones guided too systematically by artificial intelligence, but I do want to strongly endorse Ambassador Hood's endorsement of expertise and experience so sorely lacking in much of the policy making. Thanks again to our superb moderator, Abderrahim Foukara, whose show in Washington is still broadcast on Al Jazeera Arabic, which I should have known it was Al Jazeera Arabic as a former guest on that show, I think 3 times. Abderrahim is a real pro, and we benefit enormously from his sensitivity to the issues and his skill set. Thanks also to our distinguished panel, whom we are honored to host. And we thank you for your interest, your attention, your questions, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. I'm your host, Dr. William Lawrence. I encourage you to support the National Council, which for over 40 years has been one of America's leading educational nonprofits dedicated to improving American awareness, knowledge, and understanding of the Arab world, and by extension, the Middle East and Islamic world, and if I may add, improving regional awareness, knowledge, and understanding of Washington, as we do in our various programs. Please donate to the Council on our website and join and support our programs, including the National University Model Arab League, beginning in 1 week, which brings hundreds of students to Washington to solve problems involving the Arab world. This program will also appear on our website in the next couple of days. Please stay informed, stay engaged. Please keep the Middle East region in your hopes and prayers. Ramadan Kareem, Eid Mubarak, Kul Am Wantum Bekhair, and may you and your loved ones remain safe and prosperous, and please stay joyful and blessed. Thank you.